All right, welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new. I've got some deliciously spicy updates for you with the Breya deck. This is actually my favorite commander by a long shot. I actually adore what Breya does for the format. I love the fact that Breya is a control commander. It doesn't really contribute to combos. So while it can be frustrating to play against just because it's really good at suppression and threatening, um, threats and suppression, I think, are relatively fair, relatively fun to me, in contrast to something like, I don't know, a commander that just, say, Urza, that just comes down and combos you out basically in short order. I don't particularly enjoy that. I know some people really do. Um, but not for me. What I like is a slower, grindier game with the potential for explosive, powerful starts, but not the demand for it. You should be able to play a fast game and a slow game. I think that's where Magic's at its most interesting, when you can do crazy things, but you can also stop crazy things when you can do normal, have normal draws, and still have a game. So, and suppression commanders like Breya actually contribute to that a lot better than some of the others that are just hyper aggressive or super combo oriented. So, I'm pleased to talk about some of the changes to the deck, actually. So I think the last time that I did a Breya video, I had a few of these cards in there, and there actually is a card that did not make the cut that surprised the heck out of me for not staying in the deck. So let's talk about the changes a little bit. Now, this was after a pretty long, extensive, I would say, uh, practice session with Mr. Brian Weissman. He and I were up for hours tuning the deck and kind of looking at some of our old, I guess you could call them sacred cows, cards that we really had put in the deck. We just naturally just always slotted into the deck and really hadn't looked at in a long time. We kind of took a hard look at them and said, are these really doing what we want them to do? They've been doing what we need them to do for so long that we never really second guessed uh, whether or not there was something we could be doing that would be better. So I'll talk about that as well. Anyway, first thing I want to cover is what's not in the deck from the last video. So from the newest cards, the newest changes I added to the deck as of the last video, um, one of the changes was that I was focusing on the Time Twister Wheel of Fortune combos. So with Hull Breacher banned and now only relying on you're down to 3 cards. You've got Notion Thief, at least 3 that I'm aware of, consistent cards. You've got Notion Thief, you've got Narset, and the third card is the white flash creature for 4 mana that is mostly under people's radar. I will bring that up now. I think I talked about it in the last video. I'm not actually playing it, so it's not as important, but let's see if I can find it here. It should be 3 and a white. Let's take a look at both foils and non-foils and see if we can spot it. There it is, Alms Collector. So Alms Collector is the other card that I'm not using. This one, if your opponent would draw 2 or more, instead I draw and that player draws. This doesn't prevent your opponent from drawing a single card on your turn, but it does interfere with things like Brainstorm and such. And of course, it's quite good with Wheel of Fortune effects. So if you actually don't like the fact that Hullbreacher was banned, and you want to continue to attempt to build a deck around that concept, that could be a way you could do it. Of course, there's also the instant plagiarize, and then maybe some other cards that I'm not thinking of that do something similar. But I'm actually quite happy to see those cards go. Very happy to see Hull Breacher go, despite my investment into the card. So now I've got a card that's basically dead to me, but it's just a completely ridiculous effect. Very unfun to have to deal with in 1v1. I imagine in a group setting it was probably even worse, which is most likely how it got banned. I have heard that based on that, they may be actually looking at updating their ban list a little bit better than, it hasn't been curated too well for Commander in a while, I would say. There are a lot of things that can probably come off of it, as well as things that may need to be added to it that aren't on the list. And Hullbreacher was certainly one of them, in my opinion. So glad to see that nasty thing go. Um, and with that out of the way, I don't need to run the Wheel of Fortunes anymore. And so I am just back to good old fashioned Necropotence, which at least you've got to work for a couple of different reasons. The card is busted, super busted if you can stick it, but at 3 colored black mana, it is quite a bit more difficult to pull off Necropotence, in most cases, barring like a Dark Ritual. It's quite a bit more difficult to pull this off than it is to pull off something like a Wheel of Fortune or a Time Twister, which you can cast on the back of a Soul Ring or a Crypt. And so you've got to work for it a little bit more. I had to, of course, adjust my mana base and add Urborg back into the deck in order to support Necropotence, which I actually like, don't mind at all, because it allows me to tap my Mishra's Workshop for black mana, something I discussed in the past. It allows you to tap your mana confluence for black mana and not lose life. And although that does not work with City of Brass, since it's a triggered ability when it becomes tapped, it lets your Cavern of Souls produce black mana when you're not playing a creature, which is nice. And of course, it lets your fetch lands, your Ancient Tombs, and other things like tap for mana at various points. So for all those reasons, I like having an Urborg. I don't like having a card that's only black and um, a land that only produces black. I would absolutely really like they made the green version of this, right? So we've got the black version and the green version, and I would love to see a blue version. I hope they make one for every color. I would love that so much. Each land is a plains, each land is a mountain, each land is an island. I would love that. And of course, the blue version would be the strongest because it's blue. But it would also be used in formats with merfolks, I would imagine, just because merfolks like island walking. And of course, if you could give your opponent islands, that means they can't block, and that would be pretty messed up thing to do. Pretty awesome thing to do. It would also be super savage with Mystic Sanctuaries, since it would be an island, and all of your other lands would be islands, and it'd make the activation of Sanctuary trivial. It's fairly trivial as it is, but it'd be so much better if that card were around. So keep your fingers crossed for that one. I have no expectation that it's going to come out, but boy, I would like to see it. The green one really surprised me. I thought Urborg was going to be it. The fact they printed the green one, even though Gaia's Cradle exists, because I figured, well, they won't print a blue one because Tolarian Academy exists. They won't print a green one because Cradle exists. But black, red, and white really didn't get a good deal when it came to that cycle of lands, so I thought that they were kind of making it up for it by printing unique and interesting lands in those colors, and Urborg being one, Flagstones of Trokera being the white one, and for red, I hadn't seen one yet. I figured one was coming. But instead, it looks like they might actually make a cycle out of those, so let's hope. But in the meantime, all right, updates to Breya. So we took out the Wheel of Fortune combo, and and also took out a few old staples that have been around for a very long time. So I took out the Wheel of Fortune combo, and I took out a card that I had added that was brand new, actually, and that was Raugrim. And this thing is an insane. Let's see if I've got. I actually loaned mine to Brian so that he could test it and I could get his feedback. I don't remember which. It's the dwarf. Sorry, I don't remember the spelling off the top of my head. Let's see if I can figure it out this way. So I loaned my copy to Brian so he could try it out. He tried it out and kind of came to the same. I was getting a feeling about this card, and well, you know what? I don't even see it here. Oh no, it's not a dwarf. That's sorry. It's a monkey. It's the companion. It's the pirate monkey thing. There we go. Ragavan. That's the one. So if you haven't seen Ragavan, I imagine you're not playing standard. I don't play standard, but and of course this card is super busted. Uh, as I said in the last video that I talked about Breya and this card, it is the best one drop ever printed. Uh, When it deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token, exile the top card of the library, and until end of turn you may cast that card. It's also got Jackal Pup stats, 2/1, and instead of a drawback, it has another advantage, which is dash, which means for 2 mana you can play it with haste, hit your opponent with it, and then it goes back to your hand. Um, so this card is literally the best 1-drop in all of Magic, but um, the problem is in Commander, you might not find it till like turn 6, 7, 8, or whatever. And then what happens is you've got yourself a 2/1 that needs to connect with your opponent. Unlike the Dark Confidant that I was kind of thinking that Ragavan was more similar to, a 2/1 that provides card advantage, right? Well, unlike Dark Confidant, who does not need to connect with your opponent, and that's the key, Ragavan does. So it was better in Kess because Kess had a lot of removal, because Kess was intending to play the removal twice, and so Kess's game plan was to continuously keep things off the board for your opponent. Breya has not necessarily got the same game plan. Breya needs to keep off key permanents and does it with Breya's activated ability at times. But for the most part, Breya does not want to interact with the attack step at all and is quite happy. Breya is quite happy to just sit and play with your 4/4 on the ground and your 2/1/1 flyers in the air and just say, hey, you don't attack me. I won't attack you. Everything's fine. We'll just sit here and look at each other and we'll play Magic without the red zone involved. And in that nicer world that Breya likes to engineer, Ragavan just has no place. So the fact that Breya, if you have Ragavan, you might have to kill something like a Wall of Blossoms, a 0/4 wall that draws a card for 2 mana. You might have to kill something like that, and you never should need to do that, and that's not good. So you end up wasting resources in order to hit them with Ragavan to try to accumulate resources. Now the exception to this is when you draw Ragavan on turn 1, where it's just completely bonkers. But we're already not playing cards like that. So a comparable card to Ragavan, in now that I've had more experience playing it, I'm gonna adjust myself here. My feet are falling asleep. Okay, so a comparable card to Ragavan, I would say, is actually Serra Ascendant. Serra Ascendant is a card that frequently can just win you a game or severely swing a game in your favor if you draw it early. But if you draw it mid to late game, it's often completely useless. And, excuse me, Ragavan seems to fall into that class of cards. It's totally insane early, mid to late game, pretty useless, at least in this deck. Now, if you've got any kind of an aggressive deck that you're putting together, or if you wanted to make a mono red deck with Ragavan as your commander, either of these type of scenarios, the card's perfect. But like if you're putting together an aggressive deck with lots of threats, your deck is revolving around getting into the red zone. This is just one more. In fact, it is a marquee, premier, amazing card, right? You just put it in your deck, you don't worry about it. But just not, as Brian said when we were talking about it, he said, what is it helping us do? How does it fit into Breya's game plan? It really doesn't. So if you are able to connect with the card, yes, then the things it gives you, the card advantage and the mana and artifacts too, all of it is exactly what Breya wants, but but setting the conditions to make sure that you receive the payout is more work than what the payout is worth, even though the payout seems so insane. Because a lot of times you can hit them with Ragavan, you do get a treasure token, but you might flip a land and you can't play lands with Ragavan. It doesn't let you play the card. It only lets you play spells. It says you may, excuse me. It says until end of turn you may cast the card that you reveal, not play the card that you reveal. Unfortunately, that means no lands, and that's a pretty significant drawback actually to the card. Um, um, because there are a lot of times where you'll hit conditional cards that are not helpful. So like if you're playing against a blue deck, you might hit counter spells. They get exiled and it's good. It's nice to, have them not draw counter spells, but you can't actually play them. You hit lands, you can't play those either. You flip removal. Well, presumably if you're hitting them with Ragavan, there's no creatures for you to kill, so you hit removal. There's nothing for you to target. So a lot of times if you're living the dream, you hit their mana crypt or their soul ring or something, but outside of those corner cases, a lot of times the card just it doesn't really accumulate card advantage. It is nice to exile cards from your opponent's library, but mostly what you get out of it is the treasure tokens and the slight bit of pressure that it puts on them. And all said, despite the fact that the card is insanely expensive online, that's the other thing too, which is why I was loaning mine out, because there's no point in buying I think it's $120 online now. If you're just going to test the card and you're not sure, might not be worth it. I was fortunate and got mine when it was 80. I say fortunate, but I'm paying $80 for some daggum digital. I'm paying $80 for ones and zeros. So I don't know if that's fortunate, but the fact that if I exchange it, I would get more than what I paid for it is something. Um, Maybe that'll help. Maybe Hull Breacher is less. I don't know. I don't follow it anymore, but I do hang on to the cards that interest me. So I'll probably actually keep my Hull Breacher. Anyway, that's enough on Ragavan, though. Now, what has turned out to be extremely good is Liquid Metal Torque is continuing to impress. This card's fantastic. Um, and they printed a new card that's absolutely gorgeous in white. It is like, this card is incredibly good. I love this card. It is a Swiss Army knife of awesome, and it is portable whole. So I don't know if you've seen this card. It might have flown under your radar, because this is not the kind of card that most people, as far as I can tell, that most people get excited about. But this is the kind of card that I absolutely love. This card is fantastic. So it's from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. It says when portable whole, it's an artifact. So this is really awesome. So a 1 white mana artifact, which means you can trinket mage for it, you can fabricate for it, you can tezzeret into it, which is all really good, and you can even feed it to Breya. But it says, or you can feed it to Duretti, right? So when portable hunt enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. So what that means is what we have here is a 1 mana card that solves so many annoying problems in Commander, right? Your opponent went first turn Soul Ring, you go portable hole. Opponent went land, um, Mox Dark Confidant, portable hole. Solve that problem too, right? So, very awesome. Opponent has you trapped under a winter orb and you only get to untap exactly 1 land. Portable hole. I'm out from under the orb. Just a fantastic card. Beautiful design and super powerful. Now Tezzeret can actually, for 1 loyalty, can actually fetch a Swords to Plowshares or a Disenchant for anything 2 mana or under, which is just absolutely incredible. And it's a permanent too, so you can even get rid of cards like, like Baby Jace or something along those lines. And that's just stellar. You really need that kind of flexibility. Now, of course, if they destroy it, they get their card back. If you, and because of the way that they worded the clause, if you play the card, you have Breya out, and you put Portable Hole's exile effect on the stack, and then you sacrifice the hole to Breya to kill something or gain life or whatever in response, and then you resolve the Portable Hole. So what happened is you sacrifice it. It's not like the original Oblivion Ring. It doesn't have a triggered ability that says return the permanent you haven't removed yet, then resolve the exile effect, and it's permanently removed. So if you have an Oblivion Ring, because of the way that that's worded as a triggered ability, it'll work exactly the way I just described. If you have Oblivion Ring and you have Seal of Cleansing, which is a sack to destroy an enchantment, you play Oblivion Ring targeting there or whatever, put the exile effect on the stack, disenchant your own Oblivion Ring. It triggers, says, okay, let me give you back your card. Oh, you don't have one? Oh, well. And then the exile effect happens, says, I'll exile you now, and it exiles it permanently. Portable Hole's not like that. It's worded more like one of the more current versions of the Oblivion Ring effect, which are slightly weaker. And the way it works is Portable Hole says exile until it leaves the battlefield. So it just says, okay, I'm going to exile that card, and this effect ends when Portable Hole is not on the battlefield. So if you sacrifice it in response, what happens is the hole is dead, and then the exile effect attempts to trigger and says, I will exile that until, oh, I'm already gone. I guess I won't. And it doesn't exile anything. So it doesn't work that way. But other than that, the card is totally insane. I would say that if you are playing white, we now have a card that is um, at the same along the same lines as Swords to Plowshares and Tithe and Enlightened Tutor. So the four white cards at 1 mana in my deck right now, I would say if you're playing white, your deck should contain those four cards, but beyond whatever else you're doing. So if like you're in white at all, you need to run Enlightened Tutor, Portable Hole, Swords of Plowshares, and Tithe. Like, and if you're not, I think you're gimping your deck to some extent. Like you're nerfing your deck, right? Because those cards are just that good. So I'm super excited to be able to add one more card to the list of white staples because white is the weakest color in Commander. Um, the other change that I've made is that I have we talked about it. Ryan and I talked about it, and it was actually he who brought it up. I mentioned something about Svine's Reclamation not being in the deck, and he said he actually thinks it's better in this deck in a lot of cases than Yawgmoth's Will. And I said, wait, what? Because Yawgmoth's Will is an insane card, right? Like you play Will and you recast your Mana Crypt and you tap it and you use that to play your Winter Orb, and then you put a Strip Mine into play and you win the game, right? Like that's why Will's in there. Oh, and hey, by the way, if you have some extra mana, maybe you ponder and preordain and such. Um, but actually, what we were noticing and what he was noticing, and in particular, was that a lot of times you play the Will for 3 mana, and then you have to play all the other cards. And if you don't have broken mana rocks in your graveyard, and you can because Breya is good at sort of setting that up, but if you don't, then your will is kind of weak because you spend like 3 mana. Let's say you were going to will a Vindicate, right? It's 3 mana and then 3 more mana for the Vindicate. So it's like a 6 mana on your turn so you can destroy target land. Um, and as it turns out, Svine's Reclamation uh, just puts it, because it returns a permanent directly to play. It is frequently, almost all of our permanents are, with the very, very limited exception, almost all of our permanents are 3 or less mana. And if you look at the spells up here, there are only 10 cards that are not 3 or less mana. And of those 10, among those 10, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 permanents, right? So what you have is 7 cards out of 99 that are not 3 mana or less. So every permanent, other than those 7, so of the 90, and then these 3 cards are not even permanent. So of the 90 cards left, every permanent among these 90 cards, Sphenes will put into play, which means you don't actually have to cast it. Um, and that's particularly good. It also bypasses the 1 land per turn rule. So sometimes you would play a third land and then you'd like that, like that's your time where you're willing to you need to get to 4 mana. Like let's say you have to hit Breya on the next turn. So you play your third land and you could cast Yawgmoth's Will and put a fetch land into play, except it doesn't work out because you just played your third land. So now on the next turn you draw, you don't find a land. Now you have to will and put that fetch land into play. Very slow and clunky, whereas Sphenes, you play your third land, you cast the Reclamation, targeting a fetch, put that into play, now you're at 4 lands, then the next turn, if you don't draw land, you can cast Breya. So things like that, it's very mana efficient. The fact that it can be countered, it can be used as bait, it can get countered, and then you have to counter it again later. The fact that you can do sneaky combos with Teferi Time Raveler, so you can actually play Sphene's Reclamation as a when you have Teferi running, you can play it at instant speed, and you can sneak out like a Trinket Mage and do a block that kills something, or like at the end of your turn, I put Necrobotans into play, something gross like that. All super awesome, and the fact that we are playing Necrobotans in this deck also, so Svine's has the single best target in the entire format, basically, is Necropotence. So being able to put Necropotence into play with Svine's, I'll make it really, really strong and probably better than Yogwell. So we actually needed a slot in the deck, and the Yawgmoth's Will went to the bin, and Svine's has taken its place permanently. Now, if we decide to play Yawgmoth's Will, again, and there's certainly reasons to do that. I mean, it's an insane card. Then maybe it comes back in the deck. But there were a lot of times where we were noticing with Will that we were just really not really tutoring for it, but I would tutors for his fiends. The thing about the format, to kind of cover all of the changes, basically the thing with the format is that um, the format has gotten faster. So Commander has gotten a lot faster than it used to be. Your deck needs to be doing things that impact, like, you've got about 5 or 6 turns in Commander before things. You might have 5 or 6 turns and you both like at parity, like you both like burn all your resources, like countering, um, making play and counterplay, and that kind of tug of war. But generally speaking, if that hasn't happened by about turn 6, the game is essentially over. Somebody's pulled the rope hard enough to get you in the pit. If we're using the tug of war analogy. So um, Yogwill is a little bit too slow for a game that ends on turn 6, because you need time to build up enough mana to capitalize on the card. If you have all that mana, you probably have already won the tug of war if you have all that mana by turn 6. So, um, whereas Fiends is not. It's a card you can tutor for right away. So you can just make value plays early that put you ahead in tempo, um, like strip mine you, Fiends, strip mine you, all in one turn, right? Stuff like that. So um, the card's just, it also plays really well with Fact or Fiction. There's just a few other things that it does extremely well. And, for all those reasons, I think the card does belong in the deck. So you're looking at Fiends, Yogwill, and Time Twister as like your sort of 3 mana major graveyard recursion spells. And of the three of them, I think the Fiends is probably the most consistently useful in terms of advancing and either playing catch up or advancing a lead without giving something to your opponent and without a steep requirement. So, other changes to the deck, because of this faster format, um, having played with a braid enough now that, due to trying to solve the Hull Breacher, conundrum, really like the card, and the card just seems to fit really well into control, and probably just ends up being kind of a permanent thing. Given the fact that we also have Liquid Metal Torque now as a control tool, or as a tool in Commander for anybody that wants to use it, artifact and enchantment removal, well, when it hits artifact. So artifact removal is also a little bit stronger. So Braid was already really strong for the flexibility and cheapness of it. But the fact that it can also blow up like uh, you know, an Ugin by just turning it into an artifact and blowing it up with an abrade is really potent. Uh, so we're not playing abrade because of torque, but what we're looking at is, if you notice, I'll take a card and then I'll start drawing lines between that card and other cards in the deck where it either supports those cards. You have synergies, or you have sort of nombos, some non-combos, right? And you're looking for the fewest number of your own cards canceling themselves out and the greatest number of synergies. You want to pick up on those, because as you're playing the game, you'll get these combinations of cards, or you'll get one half of a synergy and you'll have a tutor. And if you're not aware of the synergy that exists with that card, you may not tutor for the correct. You may not realize that tutoring for the second part of that is actually the correct, strategic move, right? Um, so at any rate, obviously, if you have Liquid Metal Torque, I think everyone's gonna know, excuse me, that they can tutor for an abrade to take something down. But it is something to keep in mind, because you might be in the other situation where you have the abrade and you forget about the torque, not realizing that you look at abrade, you go, this isn't going to help me, not realizing that it very well might. Because let's say you have abrade and fabricate in your hand, you go, oh well, I didn't realize, but I actually have removal for anything if I want to use my fabricate in that way. So that's kind of why I'm talking about that. So fantastic card. Another card that was printed recently that's basically replaced Disenchant is just Fracture, which is just Disenchant plus Planeswalker kill. By replacing the colorless requirement in Disenchant with a black requirement, you get the ability to kill Planeswalkers. And The increase in flexibility is amazing. The increase in cost is not. There's a lot of colorless production in this deck, and it is a real bummer not to be able to play, one white and one colorless. However, I think that the extra flexibility of Fracture is probably enough that it is just an upgrade that you just have to live with the fact that you're not always going to have, instead of having a white and a color, you're sitting here with like a Tundra and a Soul Ring going, oh man, I wish Fracture was a disenchant right now. For every time that happens, there'll be a time where you're sitting there with a Tundra and an Underground Sea looking at a resolved, Teferi or whatever, going, thank goodness this is Fracture. So, or a Garrick or something. So, um, it is what it is. There's a good a case you could make to also run Disenchant, so you'd have Fracture, Abrade, and Disenchant. However, if you notice, like Abrade is almost a disenchant, right? It doesn't kill enchantments, but it picks up the ability to kill creatures too, with 3 toughness or less. And Fracture is a disenchant proper that also picks up the ability to kill planeswalkers. So between our 2 disenchant slots, we actually can kill creatures and planeswalkers, which we couldn't do if we were using Seal of Cleansing and disenchant. They would just kill artifacts and enchantments. So it's pretty nice to have made that switch. And as long as the mana base continues to show that we can do that comfortably, I think that switch will be permanent, but something to think about as well. Now, let's see, there's been a change to the mana base that's significant, but I want to cover a couple of other cards that have been removed. I think actually for this video, I originally had the intent of I was going to do a dual video, but to finish up my last video and to also um, do some Breya gameplay. But I think what I'm going to do here is I will throw in some Breya gameplay at the end. But for the finisher to the last video, because I owe it to you guys to close that out, um, I'll have to do that separately, and I'll probably record that tomorrow. And so what I'm expecting is that you should get a couple videos tomorrow for those of you who are watching and as I'm posting this rather than watching, if you're watching this from the future, then you can, disregard all this. But anyway, all right, a couple other changes. The one of the old, uh, 2 old staples. So we've already talked about Yawgmoth's Will, which has been in the deck since, well, forever. Like Yawgmoth's Will is it's one of the reasons to play black quite frequently, but in this faster format, Will is actually out. We have an upgrade, basically, Sphyn's Reclamation. So Yawgmoth's Will is out. And don't forget that in addition to Sphyn's, we still have Snapcaster Mage, and we have Mystic Sanctuary. So we have got a regrowth effect, another regrowth effect, another regrowth effect, which is another reason that Will has gone down in value because, and then also we've got Crucible of Worlds, another regrowth effect. So we've got all these different regrowth effects that we're adding into the deck, these recursion effects. And so the value of the Will declines when that happens, just because of that. Because there will be less targets in the graveyard because we may have like already flashed them back or whatever. So anyway, Yawgmoth's Will's out. But another one that's gone, that's been a staple for ages now, is Mystical Teachings. You might notice this hole right here at the 4 slot. So Mystical Teachings, that's been out since Fairies dominated, I think, whenever that was, a TSP, yeah. So Time Spiral. So this used to be in the deck, and this was part of what you would call the tutor chain, where you could merchant scroll for teachings, and then for teachings you could teach into like 2 halves of a combo. For example, you could go get Hull Breacher, you could then flash it back and go get like Vampiric Tutor or Mystical Tutor, and then pick up your Wheel of Fortune or whatever. So this one card could put together combos. Um, Against slower control decks, Mystical Teachings allows you to teachings at the end of their turn. If they counter it, great, you've tapped their mana on their turn, and the cards in your graveyard to be flashed back, so you're going to get value out of it later. So you're actually gaining card advantage on them and tapping mana on their turn. And then on your turn, maybe you can make a different play. But also against control, if they don't counter it, then you would just go get like Force of Will and then, or Mana Drain, and then later on when you flashed it back, you would get the card that you actually want to resolve, and you could set yourself up that way. Um, so there were a lot of things that teachings was good for. Excuse me. The fact that teachings could essentially get any card because you could teach into vampiric, and then vampiric into anything. Pretty good card. However, not as good as Fact or Fiction, which just often gets you both spells and mana, or just a bunch of mana when your hand is cluttered with spells that you can't cast or that are clunky to cast because you don't have enough mana. Fact or Fiction solves those problems. Teaching struggles to pick up mana. You have to like teachings into Tithe or teachings into Enlightened Tutor and ET for like a Soul Ring or something. And that's okay, but it's slower and harder to use. Fact or Fiction has been in the deck alongside teachings for a long time, but if we're going to pull one of the two cards, FOF is just a stronger card. So why pull teachings? And the reason is, again, format so fast that a 4-mana card that doesn't immediately impact the game is, for the most part, a little bit too slow, or at least that's how it feels right now. Fact or Fiction has an immediate impact. You play it at the end of their turn, and you get more mana, and then on your turn you can play that mana, or sorry, often picking up multiple cards, providing you card advantage and such. Um, Teachings, like I said, it just takes a little bit of time. You have to tutor chain it together, and it's just a little bit slow and costs a lot of mana. And it's the same problem that Yawgmoth's Will is having. Yawgmoth's Will provides more value than Sfien's Reclamation, and Teachings also is a card that, but it costs more mana. Teachings is also a card that costs a lot of mana and then provides a lot of value, but it does it over time for a hefty mana cost, and it feels like it might be too slow for the current format. Um, you could kind of look at it as we've replaced it with Spellseeker, which tutors for, one less mana and basically does exactly what we want anyway and leaves a body behind, so still gets the same kind of 2-for-1 card advantage. Excuse me. Again, just trying to adjust here. So yeah, so teachings is out, and the other card that's out. So we've got Will, Teachings, and uh, uh, an old uh, an old card that I've been using for a very long time, Sword of Feast and Famine. So Sword of Feast and Famine is super insane with Winter Orb. It allows you to completely cheat the orb. But we already have a new Winter Orb cheating card, two of them that have been printed fairly recently. uh, Urza and Teferi. Either one of these allows you to cheat a Winter Orb just fine. And of course, we've got lots of, we've got, Arcane Signet was printed recently, and Torque was printed recently, and Talisman of Creativity was printed fairly recently, and Mox was printed before that. So we've got all these extra artifact manas making, mana sources making the Winter Orb less impactful on us um, quite frequently. And then in addition, we have these two Winter Orb cheat cards here. If you look at it, like the Sword of Feast and Famine is cheaper. I mean, it was a great Stoneforge Mystic target, but I do miss having that target. So there's a non-zero chance that the card could make its way back in, but ultimately, when you look at the equipment that's still in, Stoneforge is down to just two. It's got Jitte and Skull Clamp. The Skull Clamp is almost like a Necropotence quite often with Breya. You've got one toughness on Thieving Skydiver, Snapcaster Mage, Dark Confidant if you're willing to kill it, one toughness on Spellseeker. You've got the ability to equip it onto like a Trinket Mage and block. You've got the ability to eat Duretti tokens. You've got the ability to eat Breya tokens. Skull Clamp in here is massive amounts of card drawing. It needs to be in the deck, even if Stoneforge wasn't in the deck. We'd still run Skull Clamp in a Breya deck specifically. Umezoa's Jitte is one of the best creature removal cards in the game. Between Breya's creature removal, Toxic Deluge's ability to clean up the board in an emergency, Treachery's ability to take something large, so you can handle if they go wide, you've got Deluge. If they go big, you've got Treachery. If they're mid-range, you can Shackles and control them. If they're swarming and you've got Umezawa's Jitte, and of course Jitte is really good with Winter Orb for keeping mana dorks down, and it's really good when you're running cards like Necropotence, where you may be pretty low on life, although Breya does provide life. You don't necessarily always want to be, you can only recast it so many times, and that's not going to be sustainable necessarily, while Jitte is uh, almost like hitting your opponent saying, here, why don't you draw 4, because you're running Necro. So for all those reasons, Jitte is just a little bit better than Sword of Feast and Famine. Sword of Feast and Famine is amazing as a disrupting scepter that produces mana and cheats the Horde. But having 3 artifacts in this deck that we have to equip meant that there were times where you were almost always drawing one of them, where what you want to be doing is either tutoring for them, like in the case of Skull Clamp, you can tutor for it with Trinket Mage, you can fabricate for it, you can tutor for it with Tezzeret, you can tutor for it with Stoneforge. Or in the case of Umezawa's Jitte, you cannot trinket for it, but you can muddle the mixture for it. So you have these like cards that you can go get really easily and relatively cheaply, and can take over a game. And then you had Sword of Feast and Famine, which you could not tutor for using either muddle the mixture or Trinket Mage. You could only fabricate or Tezzeret for it. And basically, if you have Tezzeret out, you're already winning anyway. You're already cheating the orb because you're going to be spitting out extra artifact mana. So it's not really all that important, so a little bit redundant. And that's assuming you don't have like Urza or Teferi. And so, other than like Fabricate, it's really hard to get the card, or Stoneforge itself. It's really hard to get the card. And if you tutor for it with Stoneforge and then kill the Stoneforge, which happens a lot, you have this like clunky, difficult card. You need like a workshop or something to get it on the board. It's super awesome card. I love what it does. Super useful, but it's just 5 mana is a lot of mana in this really, really fast format. So Sword is out, Teachings is out, Will is out, all these cards that have been cut, Disenchant is out, right? Um, so what else is in besides we've got a Braid, we covered Fracture, we've got Liquid Metal Torque from the last video, Sphinx is back. I don't remember if it was in the last video. Necro's back, super awesome. What else is in? Urza's in. But speaking of Urza, there's a card that's just utterly bonkers, and that card is Urza's Saga. This card is, I, I would say, normally ban worthy, actually, because it's that bonkers, but I don't actually think it is. I think it's super bonkers in Breya specifically, and just really, really good as in mandatory in all other decks. But there are a lot of cards that are mandatory that we don't ban. So comparable to Strip Mine, right? Like Strip Mine is mandatory. It goes in 100% of decks. It should. Urza's Saga, Strip Mine and Wasteland, both 100%. All decks should have Strip Mine and Wasteland. Uh, I'm going to say now that I believe Urza Saga is actually in the same class of land. Urza Saga should go in 100% of decks. It is a completely off the rails bonkers card, like Strip Mine is, but for a totally different reason. And the fact that this card will actually tutor up the best artifact in the game, which is Soul Ring, the best artifact in the format rather, which is Soul Ring, or of course Mana Crypt. But I mean, why would you get? You'd only get Crypt if you didn't already have the Soul Ring, basically, because it'll get on its third tier, it'll go get a 1 or less artifact. So if you don't know what Saga does, basically when it comes into play, it picks up the ability, which can be stifled, but it gains the ability to tap for mana. So it's a land that taps for colorless mana. It's an enchantment land, so keep that in mind. You can actually disenchant somebody's Saga, but taps for colorless mana. Then that's when it comes into play. Then during the main phase of your second turn, your first main phase, Saga picks up the ability to, for 2 mana, you can tap it and produce a construct. So one of Urza's, how Urza makes the construct whose power and toughness is equal to the number of artifacts you control. Well, the Saga will do the same thing, or a Karn struct, because it's also a Karn makes those. So Urza will do the same thing. So for 2 mana, you put 2 mana into this land and tap the land, and Urza's Saga will produce a construct, right, for you. At 3 mana, the triggered ability goes on the stack, which says Urza Saga gains the ability of sacrifice Urza Saga and put a 1 or less casting cost artifact into play. So that's where you go get your Soul Ring or whatever. Well, that ability goes on the stack at the beginning of your main phase, 2 turns after you've played Saga. So taps for mana, then taps for mana or makes a construct, whichever you prefer. And then on the 3rd turn, it picks up the ability to tap for mana, make a construct, and then sacrifice itself to go get a 1 or less artifact. On that turn, when the ability goes on the stack, the ability of that it's going to gain, which is the sacrifice effect, before it gains that ability, you can respond to the ability by either tapping it for mana, because remember this is your main phase, or you can activate it and produce a construct. Since both of those require a tap, typically you're not going to be able to do both, but you can do one or the other, and then it dies, and then you go get a Soul Ring. So like if you put mana into it and make a construct, it then dies, goes and gets a Soul Ring, and makes that construct bigger, and you essentially get a rebate of 2 mana on the 3 mana investment, because you had to tap the Urzas, which is 1 mana, and you had to put 2 mana into it, so a grand total of 3 out, 2 back. So it only costs you 1 mana to make a construct on that turn. Or you could tap it for mana, so you can actually tap it for mana with the 3rd ability on the stack, sacrifice it, go get a Soul Ring, or if you really need to, go get a Mana Vault, right? And then you've got 1 mana floating, and then tap the Mana Vault for 3 more, and you can actually, Urza Saga will actually produce 4 mana on that turn. So you can literally, yeah, have a major mana ramp, almost like having a if you get a Soul Ring, it's 3. If you get a Vault, it's 4. And so you can invest that. If you're able to invest it into something like a Thran Dynamo or a Gilded Lotus, then you've turned a temporary buff into a permanent one. But even if you can't make that play, the fact that it gets a Soul Ring in and of itself, totally nuts. So Saga, as you will see in the games, is insanely busted. And then on top of the fact that it's insanely busted just because of the Soul Ring type cards, it's also busted because of the constructs, which can be absolutely monstrously scary in Breya. And then finally, there are some great synergies with this card. So again, we were looking at synergies, right? When we were talking about this kind of thing I was saying, like you can put certain cards together in order to create an effect that's really strong. So there's a couple different things you can do. First of all, you get some massive flexibility thanks to portable hull being printed. Like this card makes that card great. The fact that Saga can die and go get removal for a permanent that's creating a problem for you. The fact that, say, your opponent does put you under a Winter Orb, and then you play a Saga, and in a couple turns, the Saga will die and clear out the Winter Orb. No problem. Very, very nice. Um, the other thing that Saga can do is Saga can be pumped multiple times. So Saga will produce the, you can use it to make a construct. Well, how do you do that multiple times in the same turn? Well, we've got Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, who's +1, untaps 2 lands. So you can actually untap like an Ancient Tomb and a Saga. So you can like produce a construct, use Teferi, end the turn, untap, produce another construct, and then you've got 2 beefy guys ready to block and protect Teferi. And then on the next turn, you can do it again, right? Like you put the 3rd ability on the stack and then activate it 1 more time. So you end up with 3 big guys. And then it gets sacrificed before your end step, so you're not going to get to pump it with Teferi. But still, getting 3 guys instead of 2 or 1 is pretty significant with that card, since they all pump each other as well. So super cool. You can also get some synergy with Sphynx Reclamation or Crucible of Worlds, where you just recur. You just keep playing the Saga, and the Saga goes and gets Soul Ring, and the Saga gets Sensei's Divining Top, which of course shuffles your deck when it happens. Then the Saga goes and gets a Mox Opal, a Crypt, a Soul Ring, all this good stuff. It's just super, super awesome. The card is bonkers, like OP, ridiculous, gross, like mandatory, another mandatory card, and this time in colorless. So while I said I think Portable Hole is mandatory in white now, I would suggest that Saga is mandatory in just about everything, probably everything. Even though a couple of turns of waiting for it is a little slow, every time you get this card like running, you just feel great about it, and that's because Soul Ring's a hell of a drug, right? So I think that covers all the changes. This whole thing took longer than I was actually expecting to discuss, but I'm pretty excited about all of the different changes that have happened in Breya, and it shows you that no matter how sort of I don't know cemented the cards in a deck like this feel like they can be, no matter how long it seems to be the case that you you say, well, it's just the same stuff over and over. I've seen Breya a million times. It's like there's still a lot of really new cards um, making their way in, and some older cards making their way out, as well as other changes that have happened. For example, just looking recently at newish, relatively new cards, right? Skydiver's relatively new. Torque is pretty new. Fracture's pretty new, right? Saga is fairly new in terms of like when print date is what I'm saying. Sanctuary is somewhat new. Triome is somewhat new. And this is just kind of recently, like if we're not even going into old school cards, like if we're gonna look, and I'm not even, I not, so there's like a kind of really old school, which is like your Necropotents and stuff, your old border stuff. Then there's old school, like kind of like so, like your Umezawa's Jittes that are old at this point, quite dated. Your Shackles and stuff, but not old school to the level of like a Winter Orb or a Necropotence. Um, but even if we're not looking at sort of that mid range era and that older era, and we just look a little bit sooner, there are so many cards that have been printed that have changed. Like look at all the cards that aren't actually. I mean, we can call Tezzeret like kind of in that mid range old school, but like relatively new school cards, prints that have all been incorporated into the deck, and it's just an amazing thing when you think about how good this deck is at taking cards that are printed um, from whatever set and basically finding a home for them in the deck. Um, I just think that it's really fantastic how, oh yeah, another very new card, relatively new, like man, I mean, how many cards recently have actually updated this deck to the point that we're not using? Because I remember when Commander was kicking off, and we were mostly using cards like really old school stuff, really obvious stuff, and all of it. So many of the cards that we were using have actually been updated with modern replacements. I mean, right here, just you've got 7 almost brand new cards and 11 relatively new cards. Just off the top of my head, there's 18 cards right there, and probably there's a few more that I'm missing in here. You know what I mean? So I love that about the deck. I think that's super cool and interesting. Oh, Spellseeker, yeah, another one that's barely new, and yeah, I think that's super interesting. And hopefully you do too. Hopefully you're not too bored with Breya. But anyway, um, so that's it for the deck tech. I did say I would run through a few games. I don't like to do a video with no gameplay. I have done it, but I try not to. So I'll just do the last 7 days, and you'll see here a couple of losses here, but actually not the fully optimized version of the deck, which didn't actually take place. These were all like sort of testing and learning, testing and learning, testing and learning. And then we kind of had, at the end of the 18th, we had our conversation after, what was that, 2, 3 hours of gameplay. There was actually more gameplay after this. Brian played quite a few games himself. It ended up going till, I don't know, some crazy time early in the morning. And uh, And we had our conversations, made our adjustments and stuff, and then you can see it's just been smooth sailing ever since. So I'll kind of run through that. But I'll hit you with the I'm gonna hit you with the 3 Champions of Dune games. So you can see like the losses and how clunky some of the draws were, and then we'll flip over to the 19th and run through those games. So I just want to cover the loss win here specifically, so you can see what we were learning as we were going, and you can see there was a Teachings, there was a Ragavan, there was a Will. So a lot of older cards that have all been cut now at this point, playing against Golos. Anyway, I have them all again to 5. I have a Ragavan though, so I have the potential to, do something. And look, my opponent has Urza's Saga, and I do not have Urza's Saga in this version of the deck. So this is the older version that you may or may not have been familiar with. I do steal one of my opponent's Rifts, but it's not super useful here, and I'd rather Narset. Opponent is going to get up to Saga level real soon here. He's able to map himself up a workshop and workshop into Golos and Golos into, I think, Strip Mine. And just now look at Ragavan, the card that seemed really good, right? Because I got like 1 mana once, is now basically somewhat useless trash, just because like there's no way for me to get through. It is holding off my opponent's Golos to some extent, unless he chooses to attack and kill Narset. But as you can see, yeah, I mean now Saga's getting my opponent a Soul Ring. You can see Narset's not doing that much to my opponent. Gets a top off of the Trinket Mage here. And basically, like, I mean, look at my opponent's board, look at my board. Horrible. I've got all these cards that are just not super exciting going for me. Get counterspelled there. I do get to plow and then therefore connect with Ragavan, and I hit a Sensei's Divining Top, which was pretty cool, right? That I was able to steal my opponent's top. But of course, as soon as I use it, he gets it back, and I will have to use it. And then my opponent plays Karn the Great Creator, and I'll go ahead and stop here. I never find a way to remove Karn, and basically this entire deck is based around artifacts. It's a Breya deck, and Karn just kills me. Like, I'm done. So we move into the next one. Basically, the whole game was me sitting with 3 active lands and no other mana sources for the rest of the game and doing nothing until I die. All right, so we play again, and also Deflecting Swat. I forgot to mention Deflecting Swat. So Deflecting Swat was another card that's actually been cut, and so although Deflecting Swat is super good, and I will laud anyone the benefits of running Deflecting Swat. The reason Deflecting SWAT is not in Breya now is because Deflecting SWAT is a card that it's a it's a card you cannot always, unlike the free negate, right? Which which generally speaking is pretty good. A negate is mostly going to hit something, and you're okay to hard cast the commander negate. Deflecting SWAT as a card that redirects things can sometimes struggle with having it at the right time. So if your opponent wastelands your turn 1 play, you're holding a Deflecting SWAT is no good. Unless you have cheap commanders, which is where it really shines, or if you have a modestly priced commander like Breya who will be sticking around. And the problem with SWAT and Breya is that Breya is often going to sacrifice itself, because Breya is sort of designed to die. And so you have a card that's constantly turning itself off. And when it's in the off position, in other words, when it's not free, um, you have to utilize basically SWAT. You have to use it the first chance you get, and it's so much harder to use like the first chance you get, because you just don't know when that chance is and if you're going to have a Breya in play. Whereas with a negate, you're perfectly fine to say negate your opponent's Jace or something that they cast a Jace, right? So this one's just a lot harder to use, and doesn't work well with a commander that you intend to sacrifice. Now, With Kess, it was the same cost as Breya, but we intended Kess to stay in play. We needed Kess to stay in play. The ability to play Kess and then deflecting SWAT removal onto your opponent's creature was a big deal. So that was the reason why it made the cut then, but doesn't make the cut now. So having said that, here you can see I have another card that I shouldn't be using actually here. And deflecting SWAT actually became an extra land in this deck, which is the other thing. So originally in this version, I believe I had 29 lands is what I'm facing this opponent with. And you can see me getting mana screwed multiple games. And I plussed it up to 31 lands, which is a pretty significant boost. See, there's a Mystical Teachings, which very well could have been a land at this point. Because if you notice, the card's not in the, or Deflecting SWAT would have been a land. Like both of those could be lands 30 and 31, right? And suddenly this game would be completely playable and totally fine. But instead, I just scoop here when my opponent counters my Soul Ring. It's done. In a mana drain into Golos, and I'm dead. And so I will hit the third game against Champion Athune. But remember, this is with the bad version of the deck, or I mean, it's a good version, but it was not the optimized. What I believe is the optimized version. Once again, I have to mulligan because I just don't. 29 is just really, really pushing it for a deck that has uh, like top end cards. And once again, my opponent has Urza's Saga to make my life quite difficult. And that card is very good at doing so. So fortunately for me, I assume presumably he went for Crucible, but it's hard to say. By the way, my Komodo's commander is still Golos. So, but I have a Teferi here, so when you are fortunate enough to get a Teferi into play, like you've got good things happening. So opponent just does the floating mana trick, gets a bunch of mana, and Sven's a Crucible and a land. So there's Sven's Reclamation showing you how crazy it is, because they Sven's the Crucible and then get the land back. And what a crazy card, right? If that had been Yawgmoth's Will, my opponent wouldn't have had enough mana to cast the Crucible. But because it was Sven's, they get it right into play, which works a lot better. However, I have my tech card here, and I'm able to just blow my opponent out. I plow their creature, Vandal Blast their board, strip mine my opponent, continuing to generate value with Teferi here. And now I'm sitting on a Snapcaster with a mana leak in the graveyard. And at this point, the game is over. Very short order. Of course, the card that I tutored for there with such a hand as what I've got is black, black, black for Necro, 1, 2 for Snapcaster, and 1 for Mana Leak. I have exactly what I need to get a Necropotence into play, and that's the card that I tutored for there. So about to refill my hand to full, and that game's over. But as you can see, actually, I believe in that game I didn't draw any of the cards that have been cut. So that's one of the signs, like I drew the cards that have been cut in both of these games and lost. I didn't draw any of them here and won. So now we'll flip over to the 19th when I actually have the changes implemented, and we'll see how much better the deck does. And of course, um, you know, a lot of it's draw dependent and match dependent. So I'm not saying necessarily these games prove anything. In some cases, they're just goldfishing, but it's still information that we can put into the database, right? To our data banks. So we're playing against Morophon, the Boundless here, who has some interesting abilities, but basically what it means is my opponent's playing 5 color, but I have a pretty nutso start. And here you see Fact or Fiction being a lot better than Mystical Teachings. Right, so, and then my opponent, I don't know why. I hate when people do this. They give you all 5 cards. I don't understand. Like, they don't take the time to read the card or something, or maybe they're just basically conceding on the spot. It is really hard to say, but either way, this game is over as soon as my opponent does that. I also have, if you notice, a really pretty sick synergy here. I've got I'm gonna just kill my crypt because I've used it enough. I don't need to take damage with the crypt. But and I have tons of mana here. My opponent plays Rhystic Study and Enchantment, which might normally be a little bit of a problem for me. But it is absolutely in no way a problem for me at this time because I will just cast Breya and pay the 1 mana for the Rhystic Study. Come on, Breya. Anyway, my opponent scoops here. So I play Breya, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mana, and pay 1 mana for Rhystic Study, an enchantment that bothers me. And then I turn Rhystic Study into an artifact enchantment, and then I kill it with the Breya token using Doretti. And this is just such a sweet interaction between Doretti and Liquid Metal Torque. Being able to just disenchant enchantments, things that I couldn't kill with Doretti before, or Planeswalkers, kill anything with that, it's just savage. So right there, that comes off the board, and then I end the turn, and I've got Force of Will ready to go with Preordain to force with, and Spellseeker to follow up and pick up Mana Drain. I'm in great shape here. And that game is over. So that was Corner Chris. And you got to see the Torque in action there. So Spizzleby. Here's my next opponent, and this opponent is also playing Breya. And I've got a very slow, relatively slow start, right? Like a very there's nothing explosive about this start, but I am going first, which is really nice. So I've got Tithe up. I can, if my opponent doesn't give me anything to Mana Leak, I get to do the Tithe trick here, which means that I got to go first, and I drew an extra card. So I'm actually we're actually even on cards now, but I am up on tempo, which is really nice. That's one of the reasons why Tithe is so awesome. When it goes for a trinket, so I'm gonna Mana Leak the Trinket Mage here. I could have let them get their Soul Ring or whatever and then Mana Leaked, but I think it just made sense to do it this way. So I've got mana advantage, so I go ahead and lock them under the orb. And I've got Scenes, even though I can't counterspell right here, I've got a way to recur the orb if I need to. And opponent just plays some more artifact mana, passes. Sorry, artifact land, but not really. Doesn't really have artifact mana. I go for a Mystic, Stoneforge Mystic, and my opponent mana drains there. And Mystic in the past would have been a card that I would have. This is 100% a situation where you get Sword of Feast and Famine, but it's not in the deck, so it still would have been really good there. Of course, my opponent was correct to mana drain. He used it to play a free Talisman of Progress. I top deck a Vindicate, so I just go ahead and Vindicate that off the board and pass. Untaps the land and does nothing. So remember, we're both playing Breya. So I'm trying to be respectful of the fact that my opponent's got, blue mana here. I'm going to try to draw out something at the end of their turn, but I don't have to do it immediately. I can charge like I just did and then go for, because I drew a counterspell, I go for a main phase Tezzeret and pop out a Soul Ring. Now, funny thing is I can go get a Portable Hole and just remove one of their lands from the board, but I'd rather save that in case they do get a Soul Ring of their own. Factor Fiction at the end of their turn, I take Force of Will and nothing else. Opponent makes an excellent Force of Will in one pile, 4 lands in the other pile split. But doesn't matter too much. I kill their... How did I kill their Talisman of Progress? Actually, that's weird. I didn't actually pick up on how I did that. What did I play that killed their Talisman of Progress? That is so strange. I didn't think I killed it. I thought I actually went and got a Portable Hole and just exiled the thing. But anyway, my opponent plays like Saheeli the Gifted, which is not super annoying, honestly. It doesn't really do much for him. And then I, in short order, get a Vidalcan Shackles out. Oh, I had Vindicated the Talisman earlier. That's what it was. What I did this time was I used Tezzeret to go get a Mox Opal and just make my mana stronger. And then I've got Shackles for if my opponent were to make a 1/1. But actually, what they decided to do was make their spells cheaper, and they played something that I was able to ignore or whatever. And then on my turn, I played Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and went to Tuck the Saheeli, and then my opponent conceded. So that was how that one ended against Spizzleby. And then we've got these games against Eidolon Slayer and Some Beef. Eidolon Slayer, wanted to try like a kind of pet deck a couple times, and then wanted to try his fast deck. So his pet deck here is Uro, which I think is great. I think seems like a pretty cool commander to try and take advantage of. But I just have a super sick like start, and my opponent actually double mulliganed against this start, right? So this game is about over now. Like it just gets more and more nutty, as you can see. But opponent's being a good sport, I guess, and playing it out. All right, so now I'm all set up. Got exactly one Fierce Guardianship, like I said, hard casting and negate for one more mana, still just fine most of the time. I shuffle away some of the dross, play Breya, now I can play the Fierce Guardianship for free. Opponent plays Temptwood's Discovery, where he puts a land into play, I put a land into play, he does, so I just go get Urza Saga. Opponent does nothing to stop it, so it immediately jumps up to the Saga tier 2 because I put it into play on my opponent's turn, which is nuts. And this game is going to end very soon. Alright, so opponent plays Soul Ring. Not sure why they played Soul Ring into Trigon Predator with me having Shackles out, but I'll go ahead and just take that. So I yoink the Trigon, but first I make a construct and do a little impulsing and steal Trigon. And then with construct ability on the stack, I go ahead, or sorry, with the sacrifice ability on the stack, I go ahead and make a construct again. And if you notice, so his Trigon kills the Soul Ring, which is nice. But if you notice what I have here, sure, I get a Necro out and I do all those yummy Necro things. But look what I have here off of that one Urza Saga. I have a construct and another construct, and they're both 13/13s. Like, completely ludicrously bonkers. And if I wanted to, I could make them 14/14s with the Liquid Metal Torque, pumping them up by turning, say, Teferi into an artifact. Anyway, my opponent's got a Field of the Dead or whatever and it's making some zombies, which I'm just not even going to fight over. I do fight the crop rotation, but not interested in fighting over the zombies. Remember, I've got a Teferi over here, so some of my plays have to do with aren't necessarily the best plays here, but they have to do with the fact that I know that with Teferi my opponent can't respond. And so I don't need to worry about like fighting a counter war, for example. And anyway, I attack with two 14/14s along with some other stuff, and my opponent legit just dies, uh, which usually doesn't happen in control deck, right? Like usually you don't have the ability to just sort of crush your opponent's life total. Usually it's a slog, but with the new Urza land, holy smokes! All right, so here game 2, same opponent, same commander, and I'm going first again, but my hand is significantly slower. I even have to guess on what color mana I want right there because I can't get everything I need. But lucky for me, my opponent has a slow start as well, so I get a strip mine down. And I'm kind of in a weird situation where I don't necessarily want to use the strip mine because I need to remand, which is what I merchant scrolled for earlier. So I do that, and then I draw a white mana for Vindicate, and I Vindicate and strip mine my opponent. My opponent's got their Uro in their hand, and but they're missing a land drop, so then on my turn I get to Stoneforge and Digite with Skull Clamp in hand. And so on my turn, I just run out a Gigantic Mind Twist. Awesome. Really awesome, right? Like defending, Sage, Burgeoning, Uro, which got remanded in their hand, and something else. I love it. All right. So replaying, getting Necro down. I had top deck to Mana Drain there, so now I've got Counterspell backup, so I don't equip Jitte or Skull Clamp there. It's just greedy. At the end of my opponent's turn, I can Mystical Tutor here, and then I can clamp the flyer to get the card into my hand, because I don't want to wait on Necro. And yeah, so I do. It's a Demonic Tutor, and I take out one of their lands, take out another one of their lands, the Sweens, attack with both creatures. And I believe this is where my opponent, yeah, scoops it up. Never actually needed to get the Jitte on board, had tons of life, didn't have any creatures to need to kill. Would have done it eventually if I could have found the time. But next stop was getting Coalition Relic into JTMS, perhaps. Anyway, but hard to say. It was just a great game, right? At least I thought it was. All right, so that was Eidolon Slayer. So we'll run through, I think this is game 2 on Eidolon Slayer. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit tired. I'm going to sit up a bit here. I've been moving a lot. I realize that. Apologize. It's a longer video than I kind of expected it to be. Oh yeah, that was game 2, a very fair start on my part. Was that game 2? Let's make sure. Let's make sure. I think that was though. And then we'll do game 3, and then I'll play the last game as well. Yeah, I think that was Eidolon Slayer. Because it's the one where I tutor up Remand, right? Yeah, and I Stoneforge. Yeah, okay, there we go. All right, so that was Eidolon Slayer in game 2, and then game 3. Because I actually merchant scrolled for that Remand just to dig for mana in that game. Anyway, opponent switches and says this is his faster deck, but his faster deck has to face this completely absurd hand, and he's playing, mono white. As far as Sky's Blade, which pretty cool mono white commander, although it doesn't produce cards or disrupts or make mana. So for all those reasons, it does cheat on mana, but it's not the same as making mana. So anyway, my opponent gets some creatures down, but I've got a turn 2 Teferi. Like, what are you gonna do? So I'll tell you what you're not gonna do, and the answer is win. Yeah, so I go ahead and Teferi, and then untap my Shackles, steal a creature, and now I have a blocker. Teferi's under no pressure, and I'm just kind of taking this game over real quick. Like, I'll get the Jitte going, clear out the little threats, play Urza, pump, untap, be done, and then at the end of my opponent's turn or in response to anything, opponent tries to kill my Shackles, so in response I can actually cast Fact or Fiction thanks to Urza. I find no blue cards here, take the pile of 2, so I end up having to force with Narset to keep my Shackles, which is fine. Go ahead and shrink and let Teferi take a hit. Oh. All right. My construct is getting big. I use Expedition Map to go get Saga and smash in with a gigantic 9/9. I've got an active Jitte. And now, of course, I can do the Saga doesn't even have the ability to make a construct yet, but next turn it will, and so I'll pump out 2 more constructs on that turn and 1 more on the follow-up turn, which means my 9/9 will be joined by a 10/10. Will become a 12/12 and will be joined by 3 more 12/12s over the course of 2 turns. And yeah, mono white without Wrath of God, not getting out of that situation, and certainly not getting out of this one. So my opponent scoops, but it's insane how much pressure this deck can put on someone. How quickly, like, these are not the days of draw go. These are the days of I crush you with my busted land, right? All right, so lastly, we've got Some Beef, and Some Beef here is playing Skithrix. Somewhat loosely, I'm not sure exactly what they're doing. So it's a little bit more like cold fishing, honestly, but got a great start here. Tutor up, and once again, Fact or Fiction just proving its worth. As you can see, clearly the thing I need is mana. That's what Fact or Fiction's excellent at providing, especially when your opponent doesn't split the piles. So go through 5 cards that aren't land, and still don't find a land there. So I just tutor up a saga, the premier land, and do a little pondering. And I think we're gonna, are we bugged here? Hope not, because yeah, it looks like we're bugged. So I actually had a screenshot um, that I sent to Brian just saying Urza Saga is a totally balanced card. So what you can't see is the final board state. So the final board state of this game, which ends on turn 6, okay, is that I'm attacking my opponent with two 11/11 constructs, Breya and a flyer. And I have, at that point, both Teferis in play, as well as a Winter Orb that my opponent's trapped under. I have exactly 2 cards in hand at that point in the game. I have Force of Will and Mana Leak. And it is super over. But remember, on turn 6, I'm attacking with two 11/11s. What in the heck is this crazy card? And it searched up either a Skull Clamp or a Soul Ring for me. Oh, I have Skull Climb in play. Yeah, it searched up a Soul Ring for me as well. So I got the Soul Ring and the two 11/11s out of this. Just absolutely insanely gross. Um, and awesome. Hopefully you have enjoyed these games. Hopefully you enjoyed all of it, including the the lessons learned here, and you enjoyed the deck tech. So that was the purpose of this. Get you caught up on Breya. Be real interested in what you think. Any suggestions? If you think I've missed something, let me know, please. If you think that I've cut something that shouldn't be cut, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. If you like the changes, that sort of thing. Um, of course, you can always make suggestions on what you'd like to see next or what you don't want to see in these videos. I will at least pay attention to what you suggest, though I may not necessarily follow your suggestions. But I do appreciate you, and I want to say that you should keep an eye out for the second half, if you haven't seen it yet, of the follow-up video to basically why did Hall Breacher get banned, um, and that will be coming as well. So thank you very much for watching. I know this was a long video, um, but I did seek to entertain you, and there was a lot to talk about. So again, thank you. I'll see you next time.